And joining me now is Dr. Malcolm Davis. He's a senior analyst in defense strategy at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining, Dr. Davis. It's always good to have you at WION.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
I'll begin with my first question. Dr. Davis, this day, 2 years ago, Russia launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and today, what has turned out to be the biggest war in Europe since 1945 completes 2 years. What are we looking at next in this war between Russia and Ukraine that has wreaked havoc behind the enemy lines?
Look, I think we're in a very dangerous situation now because the Western aid to Ukraine, specifically from the United States, looks set to dry up as a result of the actions of the Republicans in Congress. If that happens and the US military aid and assistance dries up, then it's quite possible that Europe will not be able to fill the gap in terms of military assistance to Ukraine sufficiently to prevent Ukraine from being unable to defend itself against Russia. If you look at what's happening on the front lines now in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military are running out of ammunition. The Russians are starting to gain the advantage of momentum. And so we could see this war suddenly turn in Russia's favor, and that would be a very dangerous situation going forward into the coming year and beyond into 2025.
And Dr. Davis, as you pointed out, Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and Biden has renewed calls on lawmakers to unblock additional aid for Ukraine. And speaking at the White House on the eve of the second anniversary of the war, in fact, Biden said, and I'm quoting him here, "We can't walk away now." Now, while Moscow has been bolstered by gains against ammunition-starved Ukrainian troops, you think the bill will be passed as Ukraine is looking at a US with desperation at the moment?
I fear it won't be. I fear that when the Republicans get back from their recess, they'll refuse to pass the bill. Obviously, I hope it is passed, but there's no guarantee that even if it is passed, that US military assistance will continue to flow in the longer term. Obviously, we have to think about the potential impact of Donald Trump regaining the White House. He's indicated already, not only does he not support Ukraine and supports Russia, but he's also indicated that, or basically encouraged Russia to attack NATO. So I think that the situation is looking pretty grim. I think that if that aid is passed, it can hold the line potentially long enough to delay any Russian advance such that Ukraine might be able to defend itself this year. But there's no guarantees what happens if Donald Trump gets back in the White House.
And Dr. Davis, waning resources, weary soldiers, what does Ukraine need now? You may say more ammunitions, but is that all? I mean, what about dwindling morale and, weary soldiers as they are losing on motivation?
Look, I think that once they get ammunition to fight back, their morale and their motivation will surge back. The reason why they are tired and angry and frustrated is because they're fighting Europe's war for it. They're putting down their lives in battle to try and defend Europe against an aggressive expansionist Russia, whose territorial ambitions do not stop at the Ukrainian border. They extend into NATO itself. And so there is this obvious frustration that somehow, right at the crucial moment, the United States is walking away from them and Europe is indecisive. I think that there is a greater recognition in Europe of the danger that Putin faces, the danger that Putin creates for NATO defense, particularly in coming years if Russia wins in Ukraine. But we're at this crucial point whereby if the Ukrainians don't get the ammunition, don't get the weapons that they need now, then they could potentially lose in late 2024 going into 2025.
And now I want to shift focus to US's role here. In fact, US imposed 500 new sanctions on Russia on the eve of the second anniversary of the war. And these sanctions come as Russia's war in Ukraine threatens to drag, of course, on for a third year. How is Russia likely to react to this?
Look, I think sanctions are all fine and good. They do increase the pressure somewhat. But the reality is that Russia has been able to circumvent most of the sanctions that the US and Europe placed on it from the beginning of the war, simply by relying more on China and the global south states to buy its oil. So China has assisted Russia directly in circumventing those sanctions. The same will happen here with these new sanctions that are to be placed on Russia. They add to the pressure, but I think ultimately sanctions alone will not be sufficient to force Putin to suddenly think about withdrawing. I think that what is needed is dramatically increased political and economic pressure, not just an incremental increase as this seems to be, combined with dramatic boost to military assistance to Ukraine to make sure that by the summer of 2024, Ukraine has the military capability to be able to rout Russian forces in Ukraine and drive them back out of Ukrainian territory, including driving them out of Crimea.
On that note, Dr. Davis, thanks for joining and sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.